In 1938, geologists working in the Saudi desert struck oil at a depth of 1,440 meters at a site that became known as Dammam Well Number 7. Within 50 years, that single discovery had turned one of the poorest countries on the planet into one of its wealthiest. It funded an absolute monarchy, reshaped global energy markets, and quietly underwrote much of the modern industrial world. Almost every aspect of contemporary Saudi Arabia, from its cities to its diplomacy to the very existence of its middle class, was built directly on top of that one resource. And yet somewhere between 2030 and 2050, many forecasts now expect global oil demand growth to stall or decline. The International Energy Agency projects that global oil demand could plateau before the end of this decade, although other forecasters, including OPEC itself, expect demand to continue rising for years after that. The honest answer is that nobody knows exactly when the peak comes, only that it is no longer a remote question. For most countries, this is an environmental policy debate. For Saudi Arabia, it is an existential one. Oil revenue still accounts for somewhere around 60% of the kingdom's government budget over the past 3 years, and the petroleum sector still accounts for roughly 40% of GDP. So how do you reinvent an economy whose entire existence depends on a single product the world is slowly trying to use less of? And just as importantly, is the plan actually working, or is it expensive theater? To understand how serious this challenge really is, you have to understand how deep the dependence runs. Saudi Arabia does not just export oil, the entire structure of its society has been sustained by it. Citizens pay no personal income tax, although a value-added tax and various fees do exist. Electricity, water, and fuel remain subsidized, although less heavily than a decade ago after a series of reforms that have raised domestic energy prices closer to international levels. Public sector jobs, which still employ a large share of working Saudis, have historically been funded by oil revenue. The fiscal break-even price, the oil price the government needs to balance its budget, has been estimated by the IMF at roughly $90 to $95 a barrel for 2025. That is significantly above the price oil has actually traded at for much of the last decade. Without sustained high prices, the kingdom runs deficits, and those deficits have to be financed somehow. The country has the world's second largest proven oil reserves, but the value of those reserves depends entirely on a market that may look very different in 20 years. This is why the Saudi government formally launched Vision 2030 in 2016, the most ambitious economic transformation program in the country's modern history. The stated goal is to diversify the economy away from oil before global demand starts to seriously decline. The plan rests on 3 main pillars. The first is the Public Investment Fund, the kingdom's sovereign wealth vehicle, which has grown to manage assets of around $925 billion and is targeted to exceed $2 trillion by 2030. Its job is to deploy oil revenue into non-oil industries, both inside the country and abroad. The second pillar is the Giga projects, the headline-grabbing mega projects intended to create entirely new industries from scratch. The most famous is NEOM, the planned development on the Red Sea coast, which includes The Line, originally announced as a 170-kilometer linear city that would eventually house 9 million people. The third pillar is tourism. In 2019, Saudi Arabia received around 20 million international visitors, most of them religious pilgrims traveling to Mecca and Medina, with total visits, including domestic travel, reaching around 80 million. The Vision 2030 target, recently revised upward, is 150 million visits a year by the end of the decade. The scale of the ambition is genuine, and some of it is already visible on the ground. Cinemas were legalized in 2018. Concerts, esports tournaments, and major motorsport events now take place regularly. Women have entered the workforce at unprecedented rates, with female labor participation rising from around 17% in 2017 to over 35% today. These are not small changes for a society that 10 years ago looked very different. Riyadh now has a metro system, an emerging financial district, and a calendar of international events that simply did not exist before. Tourism numbers have actually been rising rapidly, with around 30 million international visitors recorded in 2024, well above pre-pandemic levels. The PIF has bankrolled new domestic industries and made high-profile investments around the world, from technology companies to electric vehicle ventures to football clubs. But ambition is not the same as success, and this is where the picture becomes much more complicated. The first problem is fiscal. The transformation is enormously expensive, and a large share of the funding for it still comes from oil revenue. To finance the diversification away from oil, Saudi Arabia needs oil prices to stay high. When prices softened in 2024 and into 2025, the government recorded a budget deficit and was forced to scale back, postpone, or quietly deprioritize parts of the program. NEOM in particular has seen significant downsizing. According to widely reported scaling back, the first phase of the line has been reduced from the original 170-kilometer vision to roughly 2.5 kilometers, with completion timelines pushed back. The original NEOM budget of around $500 billion has faced reported cost overruns, and several international consulting firms have quietly questioned whether large parts of it will be built as advertised. The second problem is structural. Foreign workers continue to make up a very large share of Saudi Arabia's private sector workforce, by some estimates over 75%. The kingdom's Saudization programs have aimed to change this for decades, but progress has been slow. Foreign workers tend to be cheaper, more flexible, and politically easier to manage. Building a genuinely diversified economy requires not just new industries, but a domestic workforce capable of staffing them, and many of the new sectors Vision 2030 wants to grow, including tourism, advanced manufacturing, and technology, require skill sets the Saudi education system is only beginning to produce at scale. The third problem is demographic. Around 63% of Saudi nationals are under the age of 30, with a median age of just 29. The good news is that the headline unemployment rate for Saudi nationals has fallen sharply in recent years, reaching record lows of around 7% by 2024. The harder question is sustainability. The country still needs to absorb hundreds of thousands of new entrants into the labor market every year, and a growing share of those entrants will expect private sector jobs in the new industries, not the traditional public sector roles that previously absorbed them. If the diversification falls short, the demographic pressure becomes a political pressure very quickly, in a country where the social contract has historically been built on guaranteed prosperity in exchange for political quiet. Comparisons help put this into perspective. The United Arab Emirates is often cited as the model Saudi Arabia is trying to follow, and there is real merit in the comparison. The UAE began its diversification far earlier, in the 1980s, when its oil reserves were already understood to be limited. Today, oil's share of UAE GDP overall has fallen meaningfully, and Dubai in particular has built a genuinely diversified economy around finance, logistics, and tourism that no longer depends heavily on oil at all. But the UAE has a population of around 10 million, while Saudi Arabia has more than 35 million. Replicating the UAE's success at more than 3 times the scale, with a far larger native population to employ in a much shorter time frame, is a fundamentally harder problem. So is Vision 2030 working? The honest answer is that it is partly working and partly running out of time. Non-oil revenue has grown significantly, accounting for roughly 40% of total government revenue in 2024. Tourism numbers are well above pre-pandemic levels and rising. The PIF continues to deploy capital at scale. Saudi society is, in many measurable ways, more open and more economically active than it was a decade ago. These are real achievements, and they should not be dismissed. But the underlying mathematics has not changed. Oil is still the largest single engine, the engine is still expensive to run, and global demand may stop growing within a decade. The plan was designed for a window of roughly 15 to 20 years, and that window is now closing. Whether Saudi Arabia builds a genuinely post-oil economy in time, or whether it ends up as a wealthier version of its current self that still depends on the same single resource, is one of the most important open questions in global economics today. The country that struck oil in 1938 became one of the most consequential economies of the 20th century, almost by accident. The country it is trying to become in 2030 has to be built on purpose against a closing deadline, using the revenue from the very resource it is trying to leave behind. That is the central paradox of modern Saudi Arabia. Whether it can be solved in the time available is, at this point, genuinely unknown.